Welcome to this overview on the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System. Your presenters today are Katie Seifert from the Performance Office, and my name is Deirdre Ducharme. This is an overview of today's agenda in which we will review the principles of inclusive education, as well as the design, purpose, and participation criteria for the alternate assessment system. And we'll also take some time to review the eligibility criteria for alternate assessments, as well as some specific procedures available to students who do not have a mode of communication. Finally, our presentation will review various resources available to our professional staff and our educators. We'd like to start off this presentation by reminding our educators about the value of maintaining high expectations for students with disabilities. This is essential because inclusive education promotes academic growth, fosters independence, helps students foster independence, and combats limiting stereotypes. When educators set ambitious goals, students are more likely to engage in rigorous learning, develop resilience, and build confidence in their abilities. High expectations also support inclusion and equity by ensuring that students with disabilities have access to the same opportunities as their peers, which leads to better long-term outcomes in education, employment, and independent living. We'll take a moment to review the federal and state legislations that support assessment of our students. Two federal laws that address education for children with disabilities include the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, otherwise known as ESSA, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. Part B of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires states to make available an alternate assessment aligned with alternate academic achievement standards for eligible students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. Moreover, IDEA requires that if a planning and placement team determines that a student must take an alternate assessment, the team must include a statement in the student's plan as to why the student cannot participate in the regular assessment and why the alternate assessment selected is appropriate for that student. Under Connecticut General Statutes 10-14N, there are no exemptions from state testing and parents cannot opt out. Full participation in these tests by all students enrolled in Connecticut public schools is very important so that the results represent not only the state, district, and schools, but the student groups within those populations. We want to ensure that high quality results are used to support planning and decision-making for all students. For these reasons, both the federal and state laws require that students enrolled in Connecticut public schools participate in statewide testing for specific grade and subject areas. Katie is now going to review the general principles of inclusive education.
Thanks, Deirdre. So we all know the importance of inclusion for our students, and here's just a few ways to ensure that we are promoting inclusive education in our classrooms and learning communities. So for each and every of our students, we value and fully support them across their learning environments. All students are actively engaged and participate. Additionally, all students are supported to succeed in making academic progress, including those students who need the greatest extensive supports available. All students are supported to build friendships and experiences of belonging, not only in the classroom, but in other aspects of their school program and community. In addition to these assurances, IDEA and ESSA have the same goal of improving academic achievement through high expectations and high quality programs aligned to the state standards and resources for being part of a well-rounded education. Using high quality evidence-based multi-tier systems of support, or MTSS, are developmentally appropriate, culturally and linguistically responsive to foster students' acquisition, generalization, and use of knowledge and skills. This also leads to application and use of appropriate behaviors to meet their needs in a positive social, emotional well-being, and including friendships and with peers and a sense of belonging within their educational community and the community at large. It is important that teams recognize families as a collaborative partner, experts, and engage with them in their decision making in their child's lives, as well as value and treat students with disabilities and their families with respect. The MTSS document describes how school leadership standards align to the core tenets of MTSS, providing context for the value and relevance of this framework. So, when we're taking a look at this, we always want to start with the end in mind. When planning for any program for any child and student, we should always keep the end goal in mind for these individuals that have a unique learning profile along that short-term 1-year goal that we plan within the IEP. Yet, we also want to look ahead at the needs of the student during critical transition years, such as preschool to elementary, elementary to middle school, and middle school to secondary education, and post-secondary and beyond. We need to ensure we work as an entire team, including the parents, guardian, and student, by keeping the educational benefit of that child in mind, as well as maintaining high expectations and advocacy for our students. For some, this may mean providing resources and services along the educational continuum to prepare for high school graduation, job planning or placement, and other future educational education or training. For others, this transition may be services of looking at programming and transitional services for students who are beyond the age of 22. When planning for alternate assessments and subsequent program that aligns to the profile, we need to be cognizant of possible future implications to the student's future. So considerations that teams should be taking as they're looking at determining alternate assessment include the following. First, we need to consider the student's disability and documented need. Only children with the most significant cognitive disabilities can take the alternate assessment. Second, the planning and placement team must determine yearly at the annual which assessment is most appropriate for that student. Is it standard or alternate? And based on the student's learning profile, they will find that evidence to determine that the eligibility for either standard or alternate assessments. Third, the PPT is considering an alternate assessment. They must complete the Connecticut Alternate Assessment Eligibility Form, which is embedded into the IEP and CT SEDS to determine if there are current cognitive and functional adaptive assessment scores and other evidence to support participation in the alternate assessment. Fourth, each member of the team, including the parent guardian, and if applicable, the student, must agree that the student meets eligibility criteria for taking the alternate assessment and understand the short-term and long-term implications. Fifth, all educators and support specialists should collaborate to ensure students are taught academic content aligned to their grade, but being mindful that the student with the most significant cognitive disabilities may need content presented in a reduced depth, breadth, and complexity. These students may need assistive technology, materials, software, and communication or language plans to ensure access. Again, we need to think and plan with the end in mind for all of our students. When we take a look at the IEP and the state assessment section, teams, when they are meeting, as part of the decision-making process that occurs, is around the district and state's testing section. In relation to this, the IEP must determine which assessment the student will be participating in, as well as list any designated supports and accommodations the student needs for each content area, ELA, math, and science. And if applicable, English language proficiency assessments. These supports must be used regularly during classroom instruction and testing to provide the student access. And now I'm going to pass it over to Deirdre, and she's going to walk you through the next session.
Thank you, Katie. We're now going to take a moment to review the various components of the alternate assessment, as well as the design, purpose, and eligibility. Here you see an image of our pyramid of the Connecticut statewide assessments. The CTAA grade level content standards, which are derived from the Common Core, are measured by the Connecticut alternate assessment. So if you look at the top tier, you'll see that that assessment is limited to 1% or less of Connecticut's total tested population. And you'll also see included on this pyramid are other assessments that make up the Connecticut assessment system program. So for instance, in the second tier, which is represented by the green middle section level, a majority of our students in grades 3 through 8 will participate in the Smarter Balanced assessments for math and English language arts. And students in grades 5, 8, and 11 will participate on the next generation science standards. For students in grade 11, they will participate on the Connecticut SAT School Day in the subject areas of math and English language arts. As indicated by that middle level, students can access these assessments with accommodations if determined by their IEP or by their Section 504 plan. So based on the assessment, there may be a variety of accessibility features that are embedded in the system as a universal tool or are available based on specific access needs. And then shown at the bottom level of this pyramid, these are the standard assessments that students take without the need for accessibility supports and accommodations. Alternate assessments incorporate optimal testing conditions that must be provided to all students who take the assessment. Accessibility features should be provided to students as needed, and accommodations should be provided to students based on their implemented IEP. This combination of accessibility features, optimal testing conditions, and accommodations is incorporated within the assessment design, and it is intended to maximize students' test access and performance. The CTAA for math and ELA, as well as the alternate English language proficiency assessment, otherwise known as CALP, these assessments are online, while the alternate science assessment is a paper performance task-based assessment. Each assessment may be accessed in a variety of formats based on the diverse needs of the students. The content for the CTAA for math and English language arts is designed to be read aloud to all testing participants. The trained TEA will read the test items, the stimuli, response options, passages as often as is reasonable for the student to provide a response to an item. All text must be read to the student exactly as written, and the teacher may not paraphrase or review speed to emphasize keywords in ways that would hint at a correct answer or an incorrect response. Generally, students may access alternate assessments by listening to the trained teacher as they read the test, reading the test questions independently if the trained teacher determines that this is appropriate and achievable by the student. Students can have the test questions signed by their trained teacher if that is an appropriate mode of communication. And students also can listen to a recorded voice of the test questions and stimuli if that is appropriate for the student, and that text-to-speech accommodation is available for the CTAA and CALP only. We recommend that our teachers review the CTAA system user guide and the test administration manuals for all of our alternate assessments, which are available on the Connecticut Comprehensive Assessment Program portal to learn more about the accessibility features available for each of these unique assessments. Accommodations are changes in the materials or procedures of the assessment that do not alter the construct being measured. A student may use accommodations that are in their IEP as long as they are consistent with the policies associated with the assessment. TEA should refer to the student's supplementary aids and services section of their plan for more information on the student's accessibility supports throughout instruction to determine the accommodations that might be needed by the student. There are a variety of ways that a TEA can administer an alternate assessment so that they are accessible using the mode of communication that is used by the student. For example, assistive technology can be used in conjunction with the test delivery interface when administering the CTAA and/or the KELP. Permissive mode must be activated in the student's TIDE account, and the functionality should be tested using a practice test before the student participates on the alternate assessment. A paper version of the alternate assessment may be downloaded and printed from TIDE and made available to the student if it is a more appropriate format than the online test platform. As a reminder, the TEA will transcribe the student responses from the paper test to the secure browser in order to submit and process the student's test. As mentioned, TEAs will typically read and scribe all portions of the assessment as needed by the student and as defined by the associate testing materials applicable for that test. The Connecticut Alternate Assessment System is designed to measure the knowledge and skills of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, as required by IDEA. They support student independence to the greatest extent possible by making academic and language content accessible and the expected achievement levels appropriate. These assessments adjust for the depth or cognitive assessment of skills and abilities within the grade level standards. The assessments measure fewer standards, and the content adjusts for difficulty and is scaffolded to support the diverse range of accessibility needs within the student population. It is important to remember that alternate assessments is not an alternate curriculum. Katie is now going to review the eligibility criteria for alternate assessments.
Thanks, Deirdre. All right, so when we're taking a look at eligibility for the alternate assessments, it is important that teams and PPTs understand that this is done through the PPT process and documented within CT SEDS. To determine eligibility, PPTs will review and complete the Connecticut Alternate Assessment Eligibility Form located within CT SEDS and the district and state testing tile. So as teams are in CT SEDS, they'll locate the district and state testing tile and complete the following steps. The team will select this tile. Once they are in this tile, they are going to locate the state testing portion. They will see the question, is this student being considered for participation in the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System? This question applies to CTA, CTAS, and KELP. Please note that teams can print down a hard copy of the Connecticut Alternate Assessment Eligibility Form or the annotated Connecticut Alternate Assessment Eligibility Form from the portal to use as a planning tool to facilitate discussions and to aid in determining eligibility. If the student is being considered for participation in the alternate assessment, the team will select yes to the question, is the student being considered for the alternate assessment system? Once they hit yes, they're going to hit save the record. Once they save the record, then the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System eligibility form will populate on the page as shown on this slide. The PPT must review and complete the eligibility form as part of the annual PPT process with current data. If based on the substantiated evidence, the student qualifies for the alternate assessment, the team will select the verification box stating that they have verified this information and the student is eligible. In upcoming slides, we will be discussing the criteria and evidence that teams will need to consider and provide on this form. Once the PPT completes and verifies this form as part of the PPT process, and the IEP, the Connecticut Alternate Assessment Form, is both finalized and implemented, CT SEDS will sync to TIDE. This is an example of what the student's testing dashboard looks like in TIDE once the alternate assessment indicator is set to yes. Please note and remember, teams that the sync between CT SEDS to TIDE can take up to 48 hours after the plan has been both finalized and implemented in CT SEDS. Therefore, teams will want to ensure that they know and plan for this and are aware of the CSTE summative testing windows. We are now going to talk about a few factors concerning eligibility in the alternate assessment system, and I'm going to pass that over to Deirdre.
Thanks, Katie. So we've talked a lot about the population of students that qualify for an alternate assessment, but what does the most significant cognitive disability actually mean? We need to explore this in more depth because there is no special education category of the most significant cognitive disability. Teams need to ensure that eligibility is not based on a student's IDEA disability category, ELML status, previous low achievement, or the need for accessibility features to access the general summative assessment. Because not all students who have intellectual disabilities meet the criteria for a significant cognitive disability, teams need to be aware of accessibility features that may provide students access to the general assessments. And if teams have questions about what these available accommodations are, they're encouraged to reach out to our office. But we're now going to just take a look at the type of students that typically qualify for alternate assessments. One thing that we know about the students that qualify for alternate assessments is that they often come to kindergarten already having been identified for special education services to support their specific intellectual and functional adaptive behavior needs. Of course, not all of these students should take an alternate assessment. Once again, we need to consider the continuum of services and the student's unique learning profile. Students may often use augmentative communication devices or assistive technology for access to their environment, daily living, and instruction. Communication and assistive technology should be considered from pre-K and beyond, even if communication is at the cause and effect or low-tech levels. These characteristics should be identified and evident in the student's programming throughout their IEP. Here are the criteria for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. Sometimes students are identified with one or more of the existing categories under IDEA. These students have significant intellectual impairments, and their functional adaptive skills are well below age level expectations. Students require intensive instruction and significant supports to access instruction in all aspects of the academic and non-academic day. For students with the most complex characteristics who have not established a mode of communication, teams can refer to the early stopping rule guidelines that is available for a very specific subgroup of this population, and we'll talk about that in more detail shortly. When we look at the criteria for eligibility, a good starting place is this resource shown on your slide called the Annotated Connecticut Alternate Assessment System Eligibility Form. This is just one of the resources that PP chairs and special education teams should review in relation to the eligibility for the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System. We also include the 2025-26 frequently asked questions about the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System eligibility form. Katie is now going to explore the various components within the eligibility form used to determine eligibility.
Although there is no federal restriction on the primary disability category for participation in the alternate assessment, students with certain disability categories, for example, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, autism, or traumatic brain injury, are more likely to meet eligibility criteria. Please note that there also is no federal restriction on the primary disability category for participation. However, there are several disability categories that may not have evidence to support that most significant cognitive disability that is so pervasive in nature for our students. IDEA requires that for certain disability categories that intellectual factors and impairments be ruled out to qualify for special education services under the disability categories of specific learning disability, SLD, specific learning disability dyslexia, SLD dyslexia, or emotional disability. Therefore, students with these disability criteria typically would not participate in the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System unless there is evidence to substantiate the presence of a significant cognitive disability. Students with SLD, SLD dyslexia, and emotional disabilities typically participate on standard statewide assessments with designated supports, accommodations, and assistive technology if applicable. The CSDE monitors disability categories along with all other criteria requested for eligibility determination for the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System. So it's important that PPTs carefully review the participation criteria and evidence throughout the plan before making determination for testing. We're now going to get into some of that determination criteria in a little bit more detail. So the next criteria that we're looking at for the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System eligibility is looking at, does the student have an intellectual impairment? So the team must establish this through the documentation of current cognitive testing or functioning that places the individual significantly below age and grade level expectations. So results of cognitive testing or full scale IQs, the scores are typically 70 and below. Assessments results should be current and within the last 3 years or triennial assessments. In the absence of standard cognitive assessments, the PPT must determine there is evidence throughout other areas of that student's plan that substantiates a significant cognitive disability. This may be through other assessment tools and measures that have determined this and substantiate this, such as the VB maps. Also, we've provided here on the slide a list of some commonly used cognitive assessments for your reference. The next criteria is that the student has functional adaptive behavior skills well below age and grade level expectations. These functional adaptive skills are defined as those conceptual, social, and practical skills necessary to meet the common demands of everyday life across multiple settings. These scores, when we're taking a look at this, are from assessments that, once again, are current, that are within 3 years of being tested, and measure broad functional adaptive behavior scores. These scores should be numeric, and that the student should have scores that are more than 1.5 standard deviations below the mean score. We've listed once again here for you some of the most common assessment tools that measure broad functional adaptive scores. If other is selected, the teams need to be careful and be cognizant that they should not be choosing assessments that do not measure broad functional adaptive scores. Some of these assessments that do not measure broad functional adaptive include the BASC rating scales. The next thing we're going to be looking at is for eligibility is the student requires intensive instruction and significant supports. So the PPT team must determine that the student requires these extensive repeated instruction and supports that is not of temporary or transient nature, and then the student also uses substantially adapted materials and individualized methods of accessing information in alternative ways to acquire, maintain, demonstrate, and transfer these skills. The PPT can provide evidence that the student has IEP goals and objectives that are linked to and derived from the Connecticut Core Standards and the Next Generation Science Standards, which are the academic standards for English language arts, mathematics, and science for Connecticut. To access these standards, the students are typically provided with repeated access to content in a systematic manner across multiple settings and subject areas that allow these students greater opportunity to demonstrate what they know and can do. Supports are individualized and evidenced throughout the student's IEP, particularly in the student's present levels of performance, goals and objectives, accommodations, and related service areas. Students who do not require this extensive and repetitive and individualized instruction and who do not use substantial supports to achieve measurable gains and grade and age level appropriate curricula are expected to take Connecticut's standards assessments with designated supports, accommodations, and assistive technology if applicable as indicated in their IEP. So now I'm going to pass over to Deirdre, and she's going to walk us through what the early stopping rule, or ESR, instant response check is.
Great, thank you, Katie. The CSDE developed a process called the early stopping rule for a very small subset of students who have not yet established a mode of communication. The guidance in this training applies to the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System only for the purpose of determining if a student has the necessary observable communication skills to participate on the alternate assessments. Typically, the students who are eligible for the early stopping rule are those students who require the most complex support for their needs, even when compared to their peers with significant cognitive disabilities, also participating on the alternate assessments. Often, these students do not use oral speech, nor do they have an established mode of communication, even through the use of assistive technology, low or high tech. Goals may often include cause and effect to utilize augmentative or alternative communication supports. These students do not currently use objects or textures, regularize gestures, pictures, signs, etc., to communicate with consistency. Students may demonstrate uncertain responses to sensory stimuli, and on their IEPs often focus on medical and functional academic needs. Additionally, the IEP should document the goals that support the development of the student's communication. So for this very small group of students with these characteristics, their trained teacher will follow the instructions outlined in the early stopping rule document to determine eligibility. We are now outlining the various steps for synthesizing what the student response check looks like for a teacher administering the SRC to their student. The teacher will administer the student response check on day 1. There are 3 student response items associated with that first trial. So the teacher will administer those 3 questions and document observational behavioral notes. If the student does not provide an observable mode of communication to those 3 questions on the first trial, the teacher will proceed to a second administration of the student response check on another day, which will be day 2. If there is an observable mode of communication at any point on the first, second, or third trial, or any of those days, the teacher will discontinue the student response check, and the student will not qualify for the early stopping rule. We recommend that our teachers and administrators reference these submission tips before completing and uploading the early stopping rule requests and student response checks to TIDE. We recommend that the teacher, as well as the district administrator, verify that the student's alternate assessment indicator is set to yes in TIDE. We recommend that the teacher confirms that the student response check behavioral notes clearly specify the 3 separate dates and a total of 9 trials with detailed information. We recommend that both the teacher and the district administrator review the attestation form and student response check behavioral notes prior to uploading them to TIDE. The student's SACID included on this form must match the ESR submission in TIDE and align to the SACID in PSIS. All student response checks must be dated and signed by the teacher. All signatures should be completed and dated by the teacher, the special education director, and the district administrator. The teacher will also provide their EIN number. Again, we expect that the student response check behavioral notes will indicate that the student did not demonstrate an observable mode of communication for all 3 SRC dates and trot 3 trials per day in order to qualify for an early stopping rule. You may wonder how the teachers and district administrators are notified about the ESR status. Our district administrators will receive an email letting them know whether the ESR form was approved. The district administrator will also receive an email if the form is rejected or if it needs more information. All early stopping rule students or students that qualify for the early stopping rule will be indicated as such in TIDE via nightly upload during the test window. This means that once the student is approved, all users will see the ESR flag for approved students on the student profile in TIDE. We recommend using this indicator to help remember which students have approval for the early stopping rule. And finally, once students are approved for the early stopping rule, no further action needs to be taken by the teacher. The teacher will not log on to the student interface and administer or even open any tests for that student. An early stopping rule approval applies to all alternate assessments. So if the student receives approval for the KELP, that approval will also apply to the CTAA and the CTOS if the student is enrolled in eligible grades for those assessments. If a test is accidentally started for a student who is approved for an ESR, the teacher will need to file an appeal in TIDE to have the test reset. Cambium assessment staff are responsible for closing out the eligible test for approved students with early stopping rules. Finally, we recommend that educators review the Connecticut Alternate Assessment System early stopping rule and student response check guidelines for more details. This activity is completed annually, and we recommend that teachers complete these trials as early in the school year as possible. For this year, the timeline began in December, and the deadlines have since passed. So we recommend that if a student does qualify for an early stopping rule, and if the paperwork has not been submitted to our office, that you work with your district administrator as soon as possible to complete and submit the paperwork. Katie is now going to explain the KELP domain exemption process for students that qualify for this assessment.
Thanks, Deirdre. So, for students who are duly identified as EL, ML, and students with the most significant cognitive disabilities who are eligible for participate in the KELP assessment, it is a very small percentage of students who may not be able to then participate in either the listening or speaking domains of this test. This is because due to the complexities of their disability, they may not be able to access either one of these domains. So for students who are identified as deaf or hard of hearing and may not be able to participate in the listening subtest, even through the use of assistive technology or amplification, they may be eligible for a listening domain exemption on the KELP. Also, students who are nonverbal, non-speaking, or unintelligible, or who are using sign language and are non-oral, even when provided with either assistive technology or augmentative and alternative communication supports or AACs, may not be able to participate in the speaking domain. So therefore, these students may qualify for a domain exemption. Please note, domain exemptions are not accessibility supports, and they are not to be documented within an IEP. This is an internal CSDE policy regarding scoring and participation. Starting in December of each year, before the KELP administration, special education teams should review the student's current learning profile and how they are accessing. If the student, based on how they are currently functioning just before the time of testing, meets these eligibility criteria as we just discussed, the DA can submit a KELP domain exemption for CSDE review. If the student is approved for a KELP domain exemption, when that will go through a CSDE process through the submission and TIDE. If that student is approved and that student's dashboard, you will sit there and see the approved domain of that child has been approved for on that dashboard. So now we're going to talk about additional alternate assessment eligibility considerations. So for students with cognitive disabilities that have average or slightly below average functional adaptive skills, or those who do not meet the cognitive eligibility criteria, teams should plan to administer the standard assessments. So what are the access points used for students to access instruction and their current learning environment? Teams really need to be looking at this type of questioning and thought process when now considering their access points for summative assessments. Teams should review and determine these access points that the student is using with automaticity and accuracy, and also understand the accessibility supports that may be available for the student to access not only their learning environment, including the curriculum and social learning, but also those based on the supports that they can access for our summative assessments. So based on these accessibility supports utilized throughout their instruction, teams can review the designated supports and accommodations associated with each applicable standard assessment. Teams should trial and practice these accessibility features on training tests or practice tests to ensure that these are the appropriate supports and accommodations for the students and gather information and evaluate their students' access needs. Then the team, if determined that these supports are a barrier reduction, they can document the accessibility supports and accommodations needed for summative assessments that the student will be taking for the applicable grade in the IEP. Teams should really go into those practice tests to trial these supports. The practice tests are going to provide ability for the student to become familiar with the test platform, the accessibility support, the tools, how to access them, how to navigate them. Teachers should take that time to show students how to utilize each tool and for the students to trial these tools and provide feedback on how they feel the tool helps them gain access. So now I'm going to pass it over to Deirdre, and she's going to go over addressing assumptions and changing paradigms.
Great, thank you, Katie. We recommend that teams revisit the student's eligibility status yearly at the convening, and that they consider the following. Has the student participated in a standard assessment in the past? And this may be true for students who have moved into your district, either from another Connecticut public school system or maybe from out of state. So teams should determine whether the student has taken a standard assessment at any point in the past. Does the student have a disability category of specific learning disability, SLD dyslexia, or emotional disability? These are disability categories that Katie addressed earlier in this presentation, because these are categories that essentially require the ruling out of a student having a significant cognitive disability. So again, we wouldn't expect a student with SLD dyslexia, or ED taking an alternate assessment. We also recommend that teams look at the reasons provided for, like, the reasons why the team thinks that the student should take an alternate assessment, and beware of comments such as, oh, well, this is a student who is in a life skills class, or this is a student who is in a self-contained class, so therefore they should take an alternate. We want to ensure that teams are carefully examining the eligibility criteria outlined by the eligibility form to, again, demystify some of these assumptions about the type of students that qualify for alternate, and make sure that there is documented evidence from assessments and evaluations that substantiate the preponderance of evidence of eligibility. We recommend that teams revisit the student's eligibility if they find that the student takes a content area class in a general education setting with their typical peers without significant supports and modifications. If the student is slightly below or even at grade level in one or more content areas, that would be a reason to reevaluate eligibility. If the student demonstrates functional adaptive behaviors necessary to live independently and function safely in daily life for their age group, that is a red flag that the student does not qualify for an alternate assessment. And then finally, kind of going back to that first bullet about the student taking a standard assessment. If you find that you have a student in high school, the team is preparing for the grade 11 assessment, and the student has never taken an alternate assessment during your elementary or middle school years, then that again would be a red flag that the alternate assessment is not appropriate, or may not be appropriate for the student, just because the student would otherwise be required to take the Connecticut SAT school day. We want to reiterate that all of our assessments, including the SAT school day, does include a range of accommodations to provide students with optimal access. Katie's now going to share some of our favorite tips and best practices for school administrators, as well as our planning and placement teams.
Thanks, Deirdre. So we have compiled a list of some best practices for district administrators to consider that can support the process of accurate identification for the alternate assessments. Many of these recommendations are drawn from a survey of several districts in which they were asked to share their best practices for special education teachers and PPTs. So one of the first ones is conducting a file review for individuals identified for the alternate assessment. And in doing that, review accurate completion of the eligibility form as designed. This is including that ensuring that data is current and is from sources that accurately measure what is being asked for evidence, and that data is presented in numerical fashion and not score descriptors. Using the annotated Connecticut alternate assessment eligibility form as a reference tool to help in review and in supporting teams and guide discussions and determinations. Training of the PPT chairs on the specific eligibility criteria for the Connecticut alternate assessment system and the potential implications and programming. Continually training and to adjust for staff turnover rates on eligibility, participation, ESRs, domain exemptions, and other resources available if a student with cognitive disabilities does not meet the eligibility requirements for an alternate assessment. And engaging with families through communication regarding the process where appropriate for the sharing of forms and CSDE parent resources, and considering parent training so parents are fully aware and informed of the different assessments and the different assessment options and accessibility features. Additionally, provide opportunities to engage in families in these discussions regarding appropriate identification and eligibility for the alternate assessments. Families might not always be aware of the eligibility requirements, implications, or allowable accessibility features that may provide their child with access to the standard summative assessments. Teams should really take the time to review this with families so they are informed team member of that PPT team. Additionally, holding office hours and team meetings or mini trainings for PPT staff, including building administration and general education colleagues on the alternate assessment eligibility criteria. This is important. This doesn't have to be only for new staff. It can be for recalibration and engaging in meaningful discussions on eligibility and outcomes for students. And this should happen regularly to keep looking at how do we need to adjust based on student continuous development. Additionally, communicating and sharing resources for teachers and administration on preparing for student participation on standard assessments if they don't meet eligibility criteria and what that looks like. What are those accessibility features? Going in and practicing, what are the tools that are available? Is really important to be proactive and look at these recommendations as a building administrator, a PBT chair, and a special education administrator, as well as a special education team member. So some continued things for best practices for special education teachers and PPT team members. These are some just additional tips for and best practices to share with your staff. Some of the ones that they're doing on a regular basis, but it's just good to continue to recalibrate on this information is communication with parents and guardians on summative assessments and eligibility. Like I said before, providing the parents those resources, empowering them with information on what these assessments are, how they look, the accessibility features, the practice tests. All that information is key for helping parents have that informed decision. Carefully considering the possible global impact of placing students on an alternate assessment. How might this impact not only the current but future planning for that individual child? Thoroughly review and verify correct and current student data in the IEP. It is important that teams are using this current data and evaluation results to support eligibility. Even if teams need additional information to make this determination, this should be discussed through a PPT determination and review. Review evidence on eligibility criteria annually at the PPT. Do not automatically accept a decision from a previous year. Students are dynamic and they change and they're learning and growing each year. Teams should always review all data, including past summative assessment results, current performance, and the current evaluation data to determine this eligibility. Teams should not be in the practice of assigning eligibility on past year's performance. Review those justifications for student eligibility. Ensure, like I said before, and you'll say it again, those evaluations are current for that student. And then just the accurate completion of the eligibility form, ensuring that the information is, once again, current, data-driven information that is substantiated by evidence throughout the child's plan. Also ensuring that they are attending trainings, office hours, reviewing all the different training resources, which we're going to get to soon, and resources that we have available to support our PPT teams and our administrators within the districts for eligibility and participation in our alternate assessments, as well as our summative assessments. So continue on. We know your goal as an administrator and as a special education team member is to improve student outcomes and inclusion. We want to also share with you these recommendations to support you and your students. So once again, continue to build that communication and vision of an inclusive educational practice. It is so important, like we were shared at the beginning of this presentation, that quote from IDEA about our students and inclusion. It is key for our students. When leadership messages this regularly and believes in this, others will follow. Help build a professional knowledge and capacity and collaborative partnerships across educator specialties, from central office to building administrators to general educators and special education teachers to EL/ML educators, school counselors, and other related service specialists. We all have an accountability to create those inclusive communities. And remember that all students are Tier 1 students first. So continue to work with those building leaders to create those educational teams to create a master schedule that supports the implementation of inclusive educational practices. Continuously engage in those data-driven improvement strategies to increase student outcomes, prioritize collaborative communication, visibility, and transparency with families, and engage in and promote an asset-based, student-first language through modeling and training for our children. So we went through a lot of stuff. We do have many, many resources to support you and your teams in all of our summative assessments, as well as eligibility determination. So we're going to go through some of these. We're not going to go through them in great detail, but we want to list these resources to support you. So the first thing is the practice tests. I know that Deirdre has said it, I've said it. It is so key for teams to get onto the practice tests, to familiarize with the testing platform, to familiarize a student with the testing platform, the TEA or teachers with the platform, to practice those accessibility features and how they look within the testing platform. So there is that generalization to that testing platform. So it makes that day of summative testing something that is familiar and comfortable for both the student and staff. We also have some resources here from our national organizations that are beneficial and helpful to our teams to be aware of. We also have some resources here for determining eligibility that teams can refer back to. Additionally, we have resources for teams that support eligibility and access on state assessments. These are all key resources for PPT teams to have as their back pocket. And additionally, we have some alternate assessment score reports and interpretive guides. So after all that testing is completed, teams can utilize these resources to understand how these reports look and to use these reports and have an understanding of how their student performed. So we are always here for you. If you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Deirdre and I are happy to call, email, chat via Teams. We are here to support you, and we would really like to thank you for taking the time to review this training, and we wish you all the best in the year.
Thank you.